So we got a couple of waters and just kind of continue the conversation a little bit further. But I mean, another huge topic, and we touched on it a little bit already. But if we focus specifically on AI and all the things that you can do today with a large language model or machine learning, pick your poison. What specific changes do you think are going to happen inside the construction industry with the rollout of different AI technologies, right? Let's look at maybe the next 18 to 24 months. We know there's a lot of problems facing our industry, whether it be safety related or it be related to the labor shortage, connected teams across larger geographies now. A lot of different areas we can take this, but I'll either start with you, Steve, maybe if you have something to think about and add, AI-based tools next 18 to 24 months. What does that mean for construction?
I think it has a lot of different answers. I think the notion that AI was some destination has really changed. I think as more people become aware of what AI does, how it is a sort of a partner to all the engines, right? I think really understanding how it implicates what we do, or how it affects product development right now, I think is one of the things we're most aware of. In our case, I think the idea that we can leverage AI tools to improve and streamline our business, make it more intuitive, is one of our sort of near-range focuses. So whether it's search engines that are able to return information for people regardless of purpose, right? Is it I'm looking for project-specific information, I can query using my voice, and I can have an intuitive AI engine in CMiC analytics produce things that I'm looking for. Or in our case, Mike mentioned our business practices, right? So we're harmonizing around business practices and guidelines of how we conduct work across a really broad audience of people. How do you get people connected to that, right?
Yeah.
The AI engines that we're looking at can help us do those things really quickly and effectively, and you're not spending a ton of capital to get there.
Yeah.
So I feel like those things, we're looking for places where, technology that is leveraging AI that we can harness. So I don't know that it's necessarily like we're looking at AI. I think we can see what AI is doing for all of these other partners.
Sure.
And really understanding how that works. And I heard a great expression a few months ago is like, AI is a project team member.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on what you're doing, how it's leveraging, how it's participating, and what you're trying to get out of the end, and if everything's sort of getting more intuitive, right, and easier to access. Like we all know how it's working on our phones right now, right? So to take that sort of commercial application and make it, public application and make it more commercially based, that's this generation that's coming up into the industry. So I think we had a note there about workforce and available labor, right? The reality is, a large percent of our workforce in the construction industry and all that collective knowledge is going to leave. Right. I think the forecast is, 40% of professionals and tradespeople are going to leave the industry by 2030. So that's literally tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. So hopefully we can start to harness all of that collective knowledge, start getting a better handle on it, creating learning models with the input of those AIs, right? So the current AI is the people that have the knowledge and capture that and then put that in the hands of the younger professionals that are coming up with these new tools.
Yeah.
Right. So I just see that helps with the continuity of the technological aptitude of our industry. Right. It's a very technical thing to build the structure.
Yeah.
Right. We're talking about smart cities. We're talking about smart buildings. Right. So to be able to deliver those things, proper structural integrity, all of those practices that make our industry what it is, right, need to be handed down. And I think maybe the leveraging of AI tools is going to make that a little bit easier of a lift.
Yeah.
So we're not writing things down and handing them down, like we used to. And maybe just the transition of what we know, what should be learned, and what can be learned faster. Because this next generation of builders, they learn really fast. So we want tools to sort of keep up with them. But there's also things that are basic to how the AEC industry runs, right? And you have particular standards to follow. All that has to get captured. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's cool. It's a huge challenge. I mean, the concept of how do you distill down 30 years plus, 25 years plus of experience building, hospitals in Manhattan, or to build a large office tower, or whatever the project specialty is. How do you distill that down into the shortest time period possible to get a new employee, up and running and productive. Do you have any examples, at STOBG of how you've done that even on a small scale? Like, it's one of those things. It's kind of easy to say. It sounds great, but how would that work in practice? You mentioned search engines, putting natural language questions into a search engine and retrieving data. Have you done any pilots or any testing of how that would work kind of, hands-on in the field? Or
I think, like a lot of other organizations in the business, we're just there now, right?
Yeah.
So we've explored different options, trying to put them in practice, pilot it, and so whether it's across sort of management functionality, sort of those HR platform pieces, right? So we have a much more intuitive, HR hub that we've created, which has a lot of those engines built into it. So it becomes more self-service, it becomes more intuitive, and trying to capture that on the project side, I think, is the real challenge. And trying to figure out what we could put in place on a project, whether it's buying a niche solution that creates that opportunity for us. And there's a lot of products out there that do parts of these things, right? So to me, it's going to be sort of a compilation of this product and this product and this product that sort of becomes a suite that teams could use, particularly in the field, right? So solving field problems is a little bit more difficult than, I'm going to say, solving the office problems.
Sure.
So your residency makes it more challenging.
You can document best practices and procedures, in a certain way that's relatively manageable, but the unknowns, right, of a situation that wasn't documented, but an experienced person has seen a couple of times in their career before and how they responded to it. Are you seeing that more experienced superintendents, project managers are willing and excited about the opportunity to try and distill some of this knowledge down, or do you find that they're a little more resistant to doing that kind of exercise and to testing these types of tools? What's your experience been so far?
I think our team, everybody's all in. So we have a group that we formed a little bit over a year ago, the Superintendent Roundtable. So it's putting superintendents in a space together and talk about these challenges, right? So getting that collective knowledge. We've done some sort of harnessing and harvesting of all of that experience, developing quality checklists that will eventually be converted to an automated library that resides in our platform that people can access.
Yeah.
So if you're not sure about, hey, I'm doing a concrete pour next Thursday and I need to check out like what would be a good checklist to have, it's at your fingertips. Can you hand me a concrete checklist that I could look at, right?
Yeah.
So the idea of transferring that information, it's really about ingesting all the stuff that we have. So whether it's gathering from people, and that's a pretty grassroots version of it, but ingesting all that data into the tools that we have today. So whether it's scheduling, analytics tools, whether it's, model ingestion, and putting all that metadata somewhere. So we can do some of that in our data and analytics team, where we're pulling that, we're putting it into a data warehouse, and then we're trying to, pull it apart and put it back together in a way to create insights. Some of those insights is a way that you get that information and knowledge to those professionals.
Yeah.
Right. So that way that they're not doing a lot of mental math, or they're not doing Excel spreadsheets. They're not trying to add things up on their own. It's, hey, it's here. It's at my fingertips. I don't have to waste, 4 days doing something.
Yeah.
It takes me, 2 hours.
Yeah, and try to reduce the human error too, right? Anytime
Exactly.
that somebody's going out of a system, doing calculations on the side and putting it back in, there's always a risk that someone moves a number that they shouldn't.
Yeah.
But it seems like that was a good example of a checklist, right? Where it sounds simple, but like the questions that go into those checklists and the thought that's behind them, that's a good example of trying to distill down that experience. Like, well, why are we asking about X? Well, we're asking about X because in the last 20 years, I've seen this be a problem at least half the time, right? So that's a really good example of how to do that. And then I think there's also opportunities too with just analytics in general at the STOBG level to look at, we have a platform that's tracking all of these checklists, and are they being done, right? And who's doing them? Are they doing them when we hope they'll do them? And that's something we talked about, with the latent companies, right? And they're trying to encourage more people to get involved and participate with putting those checklists and doing them in the field. So that, great points. I mean, there's a lot of areas that we can take that, but I do want to give Mike a chance to kind of answer that same question. If you think specifically of AI in the next 18 to 24 months, how is AI, or how could AI change the construction industry from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things I was thinking about even while you guys were talking. But like just in terms of being AI, I really like that, AI being a team member as opposed to a solution to a problem, right? It's going to add to help collaboratively figure out a solution. Connect. I see a lot of like bridging gaps, right? So in that example that you guys were talking about, I would say we have a lot of experienced builders that would be more than happy to share their experience, their knowledge, their expertise. We have a lot of new people that are hungry for that learning experience and learning from the experienced professionals. The hardest part is always coming up with a practical way of doing that, right? So mentorships are awesome. That's hard to scale. There's partnering, just who's on your job site when you start out. I learned a lot from just the PMs that were and senior superintendents that were on my job sites when I first started. Not everybody always gets partnered with the perfect person to learn from. We've done lesson learned databases and things like that. Gatekeeping the databases and maintaining that is never a fun task that people love to do.
Yeah.
So having AI, like, smart searches and natural language recognition and things like that in order to bridge that gap, I think that's going to be huge. And you can look at it too from the data perspective of one of the biggest challenges I always see is just the wealth of data that we have and the challenge of getting value from it.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the traditional process of either I go to Steve and say, Steve, what do you want to know?
Yeah.
What do you want to know about? And it's like a whiteboard. Well, what can you give me? And it's like, well, I can answer. I have all this data. I can put together a dashboard, but what do you want? Like, what should I put on it? Like, do we start with a mock-up? And even that is an iterative process, back and forth, back and forth. It takes time. It takes resources. By the time you might get the answer, the data scientists, no matter how good they are, how good their data is, by the time they get the answer, the question might be old, right? So I think leveraging AI for on-demand, real-time answers to specific problems using the wealth of data that we already have.
Yeah.
But just there's that iterative process right now is just, it's time-consuming and it's difficult. And if AI, not saying that AI is going to be the perfect solution to that,
Sure.
but I know, like, Ask AI and you guys are looking into first generations of how can we facilitate that from the technology perspective. I think that is a huge potential to change, like, game changer, just in terms of how we leverage our data.
Yeah, and that's something we've always thought, as a software vendor, and I could actually share an interesting stat with you. We do track amongst our customers how many of our users actually create their own dashboard. I'd take a guess at what it might be. Out of all of our users, how many users
What percentage?
actually? Yeah, what percentage? How many users actually have created their own dashboard?
Dashboard.
Not used dashboards that somebody else
individual dashboard.
created their own dashboard.
Really
3%.
Lower.
It's a little bit higher than that.
Okay.
So it's about 7%.
That's
So about 7%,
yeah.
which is really low when you think
Yeah,
about it.
it is.
Right? If you really think. So seven people out of 100 have you ever created their own dashboard, and we're allowed. We counted them if they just did it once.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
if you actually change that and say how many have you created, like 5 or more,
Yeah.
you're probably sub 2, sub 3%. And we identified that as an opportunity, right? Is how can we, just like you said, how can we use AI to reduce that friction from someone who has the questions, right? And even as the technology provider, we don't really have the questions that's happening in the field. We have the platform, and we have we have access to the data and all that kind of stuff. But how do we reduce the friction to get someone the answer they're looking for in the shortest period of time?
Yep.
Because everyone knows probably that they could go to IT or they could be trained on how to build a dashboard.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, I don't have time for that.
Or
I'm
even-
busy. I need to get my answer now. Like, I
Yep.
got to go, respond back to an owner or deal with something on site. So if we can do something that is like, type out what your question is,
Yep.
and we'll pull up a chart, or we'll just answer to you in plain English. I agree. I think that's a huge unlock.
Yeah.
And I think, the drive to be, leveraging data to its optimum point, right? More and more people are going to start to look at on-demand information and start to think about what would I want to see, right? You get smarter the more data you have. And one of our biggest challenges is the data that we have, we think is the most important, right? So anything across STOBG, that's the data we want to leverage, right? To provide proper insights to our teams, to our clients, right? The fact that you have generalized industry knowledge to benchmark against is helpful, but the secret sauce is really in everybody's data.
Yep.
You know, so to find a way to sort of, you know, keep your data, you know, in your domain and yet leverage all these other tools and opportunities is a little bit of a challenge. And that's like where, hey, we're looking to protect our engine, right? But you do have to share, and then you have to, you know, give and take a little bit. And the idea that you can create, you know, insights for people on demand, I think is really right on. And I don't, it sounds to me like you guys are getting very close to that. Other you know, products are getting very close to that. And I think the more we put in somebody's hands, the smarter they're going to get with just that, and then they're going to evolve very quickly. And then our job's going to
depend on it too, and they start to believe that that's available to them, right? A lot of people say, you know, oh, it's going to take forever to get that answer, or like IT will get back to me in 2-3 weeks, right, and give me my dashboard. But if people start to believe and trust to say, no, I can answer that, hold on, just give me a second, and then I'll answer my question, it's going to change the way people behave.
And the point you just made is trust, right? It's valid, right? So what I'm looking at on my screen, I can trust. It's truthful, it's a source of knowledge, and it's from our data, right? So it's not my speculation, it's not my bias, it's not my guess. That's what the information tells us. And I think that really stems to, I think one of the other trends I sort of forgot to mention when we started this whole thing is the need for transparency. Right, so if Mike sees the data the same way, you see the data the same way, I see the data the same way, there's no bias. And if you think about things that challenge construction projects, it's really sort of the difference of opinion. I see the information this way, right? So with insights that we all share, hopefully a lot of that friction tends to subside. That we really just talk about what's important is how do we get this job built, right? So we can talk about where the project's going, what the forecast is, and everybody agrees that, hey, these are the challenges based on that forecast. And then you really get to brass tacks, and you're not talking about or speculating about what could happen. You got more predictive tools in your toolkit.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it comes back to, though, even if you go to the basic stuff that's not as exciting, but just having really high quality, reliable, well-organized data to do this type of stuff, right? Because I mean, that's where people start to mistrust or to, you know, doubt some of these models and their responses if you're not really sure where was it getting this data, how did it interpret this data. So one of the things that we've, you know, prioritized quite a bit internally at CMiC is putting citations in with these answers. So when you get an answer from a model, you can, maybe if you're doubtful of what that actually said, that doesn't make sense to me, you know, there'll be 2 or 3 citations of where it got that information. That you can then kind of do a double check, right? Because, you know, it is possible that large language models hallucinate, you know, we know that. But we do know that, and that's the official term, by the way, is hallucinate. But yeah, we know that citations adds that level of trust, and I think that, you know, given the nature of construction, people are going to be a little bit skeptical of a tool like that, just because it's new, and especially just because of the industry. But I think that's something that we can also do as the technology provider to say, hey, let's get that transparency. Let's provide you a little more context of where we got this answer from.
Yeah, right. But that's a really good point, because I think, as Steve mentioned, I've seen many times in my career just people are surprised by data, right? Like, 'cause people do come to stuff with certain biases, assumptions, based on their own experience. Like, oh, you know, whatever the case may be. I'm sure that 90% of our RFIs are answered within whatever, or we don't have that data populated here. Or we, you know, and I think it's really important to have that kind of citations to show, because people are, it might be accurate, but I think people are going to,
they'd be surprised or suspicious.
The more data is to the transparency perspective, people are going to have some of their assumptions challenged. And I think that's one of the things, going back to our opening conversation about, you know, convergence and updating our business practices and looking back to, I think that's one thing that we as an organization have done really well in this exercise, is kind of setting up more transparent and accurate data, right? Where from a controls perspective, right? We might have in the past said, no, this situation never happens, right? We never we never put ourselves in that position of risk on a project. So the system doesn't allow for it. As opposed to now, it's like sometimes it happens. It's not ideal, but we want to capture reality in our data, reflect it, and respond appropriately, right? Like the whole point of the data is to reflect and give you information about what's really going on.
Yeah.
And so I think that goes hand in hand with the challenging your assumptions, being more transparent with your data, leveraging it more is, don't put on your blinders when you're talking about what happens and what are your processes. Understand that there can be exceptions, there can be problems, there can be issues, and capture that so that you can get better, get smarter, improve, iterate. So I think that's one of the things that we've been doing a good job in our growth, and expansion is to have that data more reflective of what the challenges that we're facing, and then we can use AI analytics to hopefully
They become a lot more
mitigate
useful.
those challenges.
I did have a question. It just, kind of made me think a little bit. And I got to assume that one of the biggest opportunities for all of this data, especially if you think about STOBG as an organization being one of the largest contractors probably in the world, but definitely for sure in North America, on the pre-con side. I mean, we haven't really touched too much on that, but I mean, I got to imagine that when, one of the organizations that is part of STOBG is bidding a project, having the volume of data available to them when they're putting that bid forward based on past project experience in that region or with that architect or with those trade partners, that's got to be a gold mine of value for a large contractor that's going to be bidding work for the next X amount of years.
It is, and it helps change the conversation to more of a partnering conversation. Is we can share those insights, right?
Yeah.
Say, here's what we've learned about you, customer, your projects, the teams that we have, right? So being able to parse that data once you have it, and we're finding that our data is pretty good, but we're learning we could have more data points, which makes that data even more valuable. I'll give you just a really simple example, right? If you can slice and dice evaluating a 50,000 square foot interiors job, Class A space, New York City, right, for a particular customer, right, and you can say, well, we know that's going to run about X dollars per square foot. Well, if you don't have the square foot data for all those projects that you've done, or it's not consistent, then there's a gap in the accuracy of your data. So we're literally going through that sort of data validation now. It's like, hey, what's missing? What could we do better? Right? And then convert that not only to sort of operations-based insights, but to your point is relationship insights. And so sitting down with a particular customer and saying, hey, on the last 10 jobs we did with you, here's the trends that we saw. Whether it was the tendency for submittals to go one more cycle than they should have, or the tendency for RFIs to peak in the first third of a job. So that density of a lot of questions sort of led to a lot of change orders later, which led to an increase in cost.
And schedule
so
delays
what could we do that? Like, just imagine being in a room and having that conversation straight out with a customer and saying, how do we then move together forward and make sure this job, is more productive, is more effective, is more efficient, is less friction, right? Less chaos, right? So, and I think getting those insights to the business development teams that are sitting with those customers first, right? You're moving way to the left.
For sure.
It's
And
really
would you go as far as saying, like, I mean, we all know owners are getting smarter and more sophisticated in these deals. You have like open book jobs and all that kind of stuff. Would you go as far as saying that as the owners are selecting the contractors that they want to work with, it's becoming less about who's going to get me the best price versus who's going to be, the best partner and potentially the best subject matter expert, and saying, hey, here's the reality of what we're going to be facing on this project. We know this because of our past history, and looking for a little bit more of that kind of leadership in that area versus your X amount of dollars, your Y amount of dollars, and we'll pick the lowest bid. Are you seeing that as a transition for a lot of owners, that it's not just low bid, it's like, who's going to really give us a real number and who's going to partner with us to figure out what that project's going to look like?
I think there's a notion that one where we've commoditized ourselves over the years, right? So major construction delivery, your secret sauce is really your people, right? And if you can combine that now with the data and leveraging your insights that you can help develop that relationship, we certainly strive to be that valued partner for the customer, and we think that's the value-added proposition. So is it worth a half a point on the balance sheet? We think so, and I think there are some very aware customers that say, hey, I'm willing to pay for the quality of that team, the quality of that service, the quality of that relationship. Is it everywhere? No, because you're never going to get away from, there's lump sum bidding, it's competitive. But I think more complex projects that require that kind of collaboration, look for that. And maybe it's not always based on the price.
Yeah, no, I could see that. And one of the things that you mentioned even before we started was that projects are just getting more and more complicated. Right, so I would imagine that just the majority of the projects that are starting, now and over the next 5 years, are just significantly more complicated than they were 10 years ago because of the HVAC requirements and all the efficiency requirements and the scale of these buildings. So I would imagine that that's just becoming more and more of an important skill to have, to be able to do that projection for projects that have unknowns, right? And they've never been built before in that way, so we're doing that together.
Well, carbon counting is the new hot topic, right? And the extra challenge around tracking that, reporting on it, right? Just so add that technology challenge into what project teams already do.
Just another thing to do,
It's one more thing that you have to get command of. And so, everybody's trying to get out and learn more about that. How do we do that? What's really this long range impact to what we're going to be asked to report on, right? So there's 3 phases, right? So, the stuff that you can control, your consumer stuff, your energy, you can track all that, but then you start to talk about carbon footprint for materials provided to a job site. Now you're talking some really complex solutions, right? And project teams are going to be asked to sort of manage that. So to your point is even a $10 million job that we would have maybe argued 10 years ago, it's probably not that complex just because of the value of it. They're all getting more complex, more technical, period. Just lighting systems alone in a typical office space are very complex. They're really smart, right? So it's high tech. So you really have to understand how it works, and you have to find the right subcontractors, suppliers to do that work. And not everybody's proficient at the newest technology. Right. So
all comes back to
who's really got to handle
current,
that.
and that can get you that extra half point, right? On a project like that, for sure. So there's a ton of good stuff to talk about with AI. Is there anything else you guys want to add to that domain before we move on?
I think the piece about visual data
That's what I was thinking.
is really one. It's curious because we've been talking about things like this for at least 5 or 6 years. Right, the visual capture, but the fact that it's really progressing to the point that you can use it similarly, whereas, hey, picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So that video capture, comparing to the model, looking at progress, how much should I pay the sub, right? So alleviating all those things that chew up a lot of time, right? But then having the infrastructure that supports all of those technology pieces that go together, right, that's really the wave that I was talking about when we started this, right? So you got modeling that sort of gets us started. You got reality capture that sort of puts the icing on the cake, right? How do we get those 2 things to meet in between? And then how does Mike help us keep the train on the rails? That AI is going to be the consistent thread through all of those things, and hopefully build that faster, right? And take away a lot of that stuff that we would normally be keystroking or we'd be figuring out, is that we're going to leverage that engine to iterate, make us smarter and make us move a little bit faster. So the things that we think about today, Steve, we're on a 3-year arc. Is it really going to be a 3-year arc, or is AI going to turn that into a 12-month arc? And I think that's what we've got to be prepared for. Things moving faster than we expect, and that's not always easy to do. Construction's got so many variables. How do you keep a grasp on that? And we want to sort of equip ourselves to be that nimble, flexible, ready for those changes.
Where do you see, and this is one thing, there's a lot of discussion about BIM and reality capture for safety, progress tracking, things of that nature. But, you don't hear as much talked about when it comes to, the reality capture, BIM for the financial transactions that are going to be happening on the project, right? So you're going to have subs that want to get paid. You're going to have owners that want to review what they're paying for. as a result of that. I mean, is STOBG doing anything in that space or focusing on anything that's kind of a little more related to the dollars that are, tied to the physical space that people are looking at when they look at these photos?
Yeah, there's some really good early examples about quantity measurements. So if you put that metadata in however you're going to measure, whether it's you're leveraging it in the drawings or you're putting it in the model and then you're doing progress reports against the model. So we've got some early examples of that help automatically generate the quantity comparisons and then say, hey, that can go into your invoice.
Yeah.
And then create the invoice, review the invoice. I think the evolution is naturally going to be take away a lot of those manual transition steps and get to does the visual capture match the model? There's a list of values. We can create the invoice, and then instead of transition, client pays the CM pays the sub pays the supplier. You're taking a blockchain mentality as, hey, money should flow seamlessly without all the transitions. So in the pool, everybody gets paid at the point it's confirmed, right? So that you're not saying, do I really agree that it's 11,000 lineal feet of pipe or not? We know because there's a picture that says I've done it, and the AI engine says, hey, I've checked this. It's this value, and I know what the list of values is.
Or they have their AI validating your AI.
Yeah, and the amount of checking we do, right?
Yeah.
So I'm an ops guy, so it's really all about the field, right?
Yeah.
So how much time does it take to go verify are all these walls painted or not?
Yeah.
Well, if I've got a visual capture partner, whether it's the robot, whether it's a drone, whatever, and that can pick it up and say, hey, I've got 70% of this done, pay 70%, good,
Yeah.
everybody's cool,
Yeah.
right? And the valid part of it is, we know it's done because we can see it.
It speeds up the transaction, subs get paid sooner, everybody's happy.
Which is a huge burden on the industry, right? Cash flow is always a burden, and getting people paid on time means, the stress on the supply chain isn't burdened by cash flow.
Have you seen that? I mean, I would imagine even in the last 12 months with interest rates going up to where they have been, that's probably become even more important, right? Because these, their subs, if they're working off of line of credits, their line of credits are that much more expensive. Right.
Yeah, and sometimes you can get creative where if you can get a team together to say, hey, let's do expedited payments, whether it's mid-month, instead of waiting 30 days to get paid, if the work's complete, let's do a mid-month billing, and sometimes that helps, and that the real piece is people are carrying their resources, their people, which are the expensive part, right? So in order to get that cash flow going for paying salaries and benefits, like that's a huge improvement.
Yeah. And are you just, you mentioned something at the very beginning, like a picture's worth 1,000 words. And I would imagine that if your projects are getting more complex, it's probably harder for an owner, an owner's rep to even sometimes understand the invoice, because if the level of detail of the invoice and the way it's structured is kind of hard for someone to visualize. So being able to connect an invoice to a model, so when we're having a sit down and doing a pencil copy review, whatever it might be, it's like, oh no, hold on, instead of looking at the spreadsheet, let's just throw this up on a screen here. So these line items here, they tie out to what we see up on the screen here. And that's something we've talked a lot about internally, because obviously, our company, CMiC, being very focused on the financials and seeing even more opportunities on how you can visualize some of these things, right?
Yeah, and some of that seems aspirational at times when we talk about it, but I'm convinced it's soon.
Yeah, it shouldn't be.
I think more people, if you can embrace the fact that the proof of the data, right, is it's secure, it's valid, you can trust it, it's credible, then you kind of move past that hurdle of I have to see it on a piece of paper.
Sure.
Right, and so to back to the original point on the list, digitization, right?
Yeah.
Is why do we keep putting stuff on paper and then taking it off of paper and putting it back in a digital form?
Yeah.
Just keep it going. And I think you tell me, like, even just in the software development universe, is you deal with different vendors. Some are really sophisticated, some are not very sophisticated. So you find a variation of how we interact and do business, right? So multiply that by X when you're talking about subcontractors, suppliers, vendors, raw material suppliers. So I mean the chain is huge and it's very complex, and getting that to flow seamlessly would be a huge improvement.
Even just to draw a parallel, when we're building product, usually we always push the team, put a mock-up in front of people as soon as possible, right? Just because as soon as the mock-up goes up, that's when it's like, oh, that's what you meant by this, or oh, okay, I had something different in mind. So it's no different. You're building a building, right? As soon as someone sees the visual, that's where the dots get connected pretty quickly.
Yep. Cool.
Mike, anything you want to add before we move on to our next question?
No.
Okay, one more topic we're going to go into. So, we're just want to do a quick time check. Okay, so we'll wrap up after this one. So, last question. We can keep it pretty open form, but we're post-COVID. A lot of things change in construction after the pandemic. Some positive, maybe some not so much. We're still dealing in a pretty high interest rate environment. We're still dealing with challenges with logistics. So, what are some of the things that STOBG has done post-COVID that maybe are good business practices that were kind of really necessary in a post-pandemic era that we think, are going to stay here for the long haul? And how have things changed in, now we're 2-3 years or 2 years outside of COVID. What's kind of gone through your mind in terms of what business practices are here to stay because of that experience, and how has the landscape changed now that things are opening up a little bit more in terms of moving materials and people are greenlighting more projects?
That is a big ocean.
Yeah.
So from I think a construction delivery perspective, right? So offsite fabrication, having things known, available, and deliverable to the job site, we all learned that not everything is readily available.
Yeah.
Right. So really understanding your supply chain is really important. So much to the fact that we have, been working on global supply chain reports. So we have, appointed a new procurement leader across STOBG to sort of integrate what's happening around the organization. So whether it's electrical switchgear, challenges or things that that fluctuate, with great frequency, is do we know that you can get the stuff to the job site to build, right? Once the stuff's there, you can stay on track and stay on plan. But we found, I think, the continuity of projects is all based on available materials, and it was no more amplified during that period, than any time in certainly my history, being a builder. So I think the idea that we are aware that could be upended at any point in time is now looking at how do we get better command over the supply chain.
Sure.
And it's a big topic, but I think that's one good byproduct, right? I think the other thing is remote connectivity. We could do video inspections of work in place when inspectors were having difficulty getting to job sites. And I think that's now been adopted as it's okay because I have those tools available to make it possible for people. Obviously meetings, remote meetings, like everybody knows there's no substitute for this, right? Sitting in a room together. But I think we all got more comfortable with remote meetings and being productive and effective. Right? So, and I think the other piece is for certain, roles and functions in the industry, working from home, or flex time, that allows people to have a better work-life balance. I think, it's kind of weird to say that's a byproduct of the stress we all went through. But true point.
Well, and I think
those are great.
that's helped a lot from my perspective, certainly in terms of the challenge of finding people, right? And the pool, like now you can find people anywhere in some instances. Obviously, there's a physical element of construction that you can't get away from, but a lot of the support roles and some of the back office roles and everything, are not as tied to a physical location, and it just opens up much more opportunity in terms of finding talent.
Finding the best talent,
exactly, finding the right fit, and I would even say just pre-pandemic, when people weren't as comfortable with remote interaction, it would have been harder for STOBG to leverage as much the remote expertise that we have. Right? Even if I just think that as an organization, we're more connected across our geographies now than we were previously. It was much more isolated because it was more about the physical offices.
Sure.
And you'd have to have a big, conference or bring everybody together in an office in order to start getting some of that connection.
Yeah.
And during the pandemic and continuing, at least from my perspective, so I hope it's true across the board, that there's just a much more natural connection. And that enables us to be able to say, oh, I know, somebody out in Layton or somebody out in California or somebody down in Florida has some experience with this challenge, whether it's a construction challenge or a back office challenge or whatever, and bring those people together in order to, and I think that really was facilitated by everybody's increased comfort with.
Yeah, you had to build that muscle,
Yep.
right? It's a different way of working. There are some pros and cons, of course, to everything, but it's a different way of working. So everyone kind of got used to working that muscle, and then
Yep.
now it's just become another tool,
Yeah.
right? Can we do a quick conference on a Teams meeting, a Zoom call, whatever? Or you know what, this is a big enough topic that we need to get in person and we can do a whiteboard session
Yep.
together. Now you kind of have both, and it's kind of acceptable to do either one,
Yep.
right? That's good. Any final closing comments before we wrap up?
Yeah, that was great.
A good conversation. Well, I just want
Yeah.
to thank you guys so much for having me down. We are filming here in New York, so appreciate letting me come down and visit, and appreciate
Great
all
to have
the
you.
thoughts and insights, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks
Cheers.
very much.
All right, thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Steve.
Thank you.